We don't make a big opening, just a few words to start. To start the evening, and you know that this is the concluding third workshop of our project, which is organized by the Center for Advanced Studies in Sofia and sponsored by the Center for Governance and Culture in the University of St. Gallen. I think that the goal of our network has been attained. We have established a true network through those three workshops we have here and the other initiatives of the network. We have established a community in the genuine sense of the word. That means people who know each other. Most of you have met in the previous two workshops. People who speak to each other and think together. This is the basic idea of a network, I think. And here you have some statistical evidence of our activities. It's not the best way to see, I think, on this wall, but anyway, those are the numbers of our activities, with having 33 participants in all the activities of the workshops, having 11 beneficiaries of the research allowances program of the center, which is also part of our network, and also the focus of the different topics that have been discussed in our workshop, which show a clear bias towards the Ottoman period, maybe, and also, of course, a better representation of the Orthodox monasticism than of the Catholic monasticism. But anyway, the idea behind the network was to have a comparative perspective, comparative look between the Orthodox and the Catholic monasticism. And the network has a future, I think, even if the project is ending this year. The network has a future because you know each other and you have contact between each other. And some personal projects are still ongoing, so we are looking forward to reading the results of those personal projects. And the contacts will be, I think, will be maintained between all of us in the future. So today we have the third keynote speaker in our program, and it's the pleasure to introduce Kostis Smyrlis, who kindly accepted the invitation to give a talk on the Great Byzantine Monastery as a success story. So you can shift to the presentation. Kostis has been an associate professor at the New York University till those days, and since June 2019, he's a researcher at the National Hellenic Research Foundation in Athens. Kostis had a master's degree in Byzantine studies from the Birmingham Universities in 1995, and he earned his PhD degree from the University of Paris, La Sorbonne, in 2002. His major fields of interest are the Byzantine Empire from the 9th to the 15th century, economic and social history, political economy, taxation and state finances, settlement and demography, law and land ownership, and of course the archives of Mount Athos. He has published the seminal book La fortune des grands monastères byzantins, fin du Xe et du XIVe siècle, published in Paris in 2006, and he has contributed also to the les actes d'Athone, namely the act of Vatopedi. He is preparing a book also on dealing with the political economy of the Byzantine Empire from the 11th to the 14th century. So, Kostis, you have the floor.
Many thanks for the introduction, Roman, and many thanks for the invitation to this wonderful organization and network. We're very glad to be meeting you all of you, and looking forward to our discussions here. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, that's at least as loud. Okay, so I noticed that from your statistics that I'm exceptionally early in this network.
We did a lecture on the fathers, the ancient fathers.
Okay, so it's a very basic talk then. And no, if you don't understand something, please interrupt me and I can explain. So no other institution of medieval Byzantium could match the Great Monastery in its capacity to perform an array of different functions within society. Monasteries were unique in that they tended to be freestanding and long-lasting establishments led by highly skilled individuals who administered their endowments and directed their various functions. Monasteries could be projects aiming at securing the fortune of the family, vehicles for representing imperial ideology, cultural centers, great landowners, leaders of local communities, health, pension and charity providers, lenders or keepers of money, to name just some of the more known, obvious functions of monasteries. So now when I say medieval Byzantium, this is the period extending from the 9th to the 15th century. It's a very long period. My focus today are the Great Byzantine Monasteries, or rather the Great Byzantine Monastery of the title as a type, regardless of its location, whether it was rural or urban, whether its founder was the emperor, a layman, a churchman, or a monk, and whether or not it was independent from an individual or an authority. By great, I mean those establishments housing dozens of monks and possessing extensive fortunes, comprising several estates or villages. Led by individuals originating from the aristocracy, these establishments maintain privileged relations with the emperor and the elite. As my title indicates, I argue that the story of the Great Byzantine Monastery is the one of success. Success is measured by the degree to which the goals set are achieved. In the case of the Great Byzantine Monasteries, one can distinguish three main aims. First and foremost was what, at least in principle, was the reason of being of the monasteries: to enable a number of monks to dedicate their lives to prayer. Another aim was to cater to certain spiritual and material needs of society. And a third and final goal of the monasteries, the Great Monasteries, was to provide certain services to the emperor and the state. These are the three main aims I see. So my paper develops in three parts. The first part, I briefly discuss the institutional and ideological framework that define the aims the great monasteries ought to pursue, as well as the means by which they were to achieve them. And in the second part, I turn to examine these goals and results achieved by the monasteries. And my final longest third part focuses on one of these aims, namely the one of the monasteries, the aim of the monasteries to serve the empire or the emperor. A role which, although often discussed, remains insufficiently understood, and its role, and the importance of its role, often underestimated. To do this, I use the well-documented case of Mount Athos Monastery, so at least I belong to the category of Mount Athos. One of the main premises of this paper is that the Great Monastery of the Byzantine Middle Ages was the product of specific historical circumstances, and above all, of the decision of 9th and 10th century emperors to make monasteries a constituent element of imperial ideology. The main factors that came together in the 9th and 10th century would remain valid in Byzantium until the 14th century, after which the context changed dramatically. Our conference is interdisciplinary, albeit with an emphasis on Eastern monasticism, so it is, I think, an ideal occasion to explore the extent to which the historically specific characteristics of the Great Byzantine Monastery remain valid under the Ottomans or the nation states, and whether such notions are applicable to the Western houses. So, the first part on the institutional and ideological framework. Although the character of the Great Byzantine Monastery crystallized in the Middle Ages, many essential elements were actually inherited from the earlier Christian Empire of the 4th to the 6th century. Those are what I call traditional elements. First of which was, first and most basic characteristic was the notion itself of the kinobion in Greek, so the communal house, comprising a numerous community of monks living in poverty under the authority of the abbot and dedicated to prayer to God. The prayers of the monks aimed at ensuring the salvation of the soul of themselves, first of all, but also of society at large. The association of monasticism to charity work is also traditional, but it was generally of secondary importance. So the idea of poverty implied that monastery should only take care of the monks' basic needs, and so that they may devote themselves to prayer. Monasteries ought not pursue anything beyond that. Seeking excessive comfort or wealth was not allowed or criticized. Was criticized. To meet the monks' needs, monasteries had to have steady sources of revenue, which usually meant rent-producing immovables, land and buildings. This in turn meant that monasteries had to possess an administrative personnel to manage these properties. So all this came together, is all implied in this basic institutional tradition. A second traditional element is inherited from this early period, is the monastery as a recipient of donation of movables and immovables offered by laymen, most significantly obviously the wealthy ones, as well as by the emperor. Providing cash or source of revenue was justified by the idea that the monks ought not worry about worldly matters, but devote themselves to prayer for the good of society and the empire. In reality, there were many additional motives behind donations, and the monks ought to deliver more than just prayer. In any case, the position of being the recipient of more or less regular donations impacted the behavior of the monks, instilling on the one hand a certain passivity as far as their economic activities are concerned, and on the other encouraging them to cultivate their relations with the wealthy and powerful, so it impacted their economic behavior obviously. A final traditional element I want to note is from late antiquity is that the significant amount of legislation produced in that time which concerned monasteries and which in general may be characterized as protective and restrictive. Many of these restrictions were not really enforced for very long periods, with the notable exception of the inalienability of monastic properties, which was something we see throughout the period up to the end of the empire, being respected, and so the monks could not really do as they pleased with their properties, immovable rather especially. Overall, the legal framework and its medieval commentators underlined that the monks ought to pursue spiritual rather than material aims. surprising. Now come to the middle period. You will notice there is a gap there of 2 centuries. So this is because there is almost a total break in the flow of information after the 6th century. The 7th and 8th centuries are the Byzantine Dark Ages. What we can see, nevertheless, suggests that the monasteries fared rather poorly in this time. Many of them disappeared altogether, and the remainder struggled to survive. This phenomenon reflected the general economic collapse and the impoverishment of the state and its elite in those centuries. In purely ideological terms, however, monasticism emerged from this period strengthened, as monks managed to establish themselves in the Byzantine conscience as the main victims of iconoclasm and as the principal defenders of icon worship, leading the resistance against the heretical emperors of the 8th and early 9th century. So this, the monasteries emerging as the champions of Orthodoxy certainly played a role in the momentous decision of the emperors to make monasteries an essential element of imperial ideology. As it has been shown recently by Paul Magdaleno, monasteries in the 9th to 10th centuries, there occurred a huge shift in the value emperors placed in monasteries as source of political strength. Monastic approval became essential to the ruler's legitimacy and ascetic prayer, a vital component of imperial victory. This was naturally accompanied by a shift in the emperor's patronage of monasteries. Imperial donations to monasteries in late antiquity were common, but there was nothing like what we see in the Middle Ages. From the 9th and 10th century onwards, we witnessed the foundation of a series of great monasteries by emperors. Moreover, from this time, all important monasteries were to receive imperial support. They were awarded annual cash subventions, tax exemptions, as well as estates. And the monasteries were also given peasant households, often entire villages, a practice which from the 12th century onwards was assimilated to the concessions awarded to military and civil imperial servants. It was done in exactly the same way as they did with the imperial servants they gave to the monasteries. So in this sense, monasteries became officially servants in the pay of the emperor. All this patronage came with obligations, of course, of both ideological and practical nature, which I will discuss later. The attachment of the monastery to the imperial office is certainly the greatest innovation after late antiquity in the definition of the character of the monastery. This change goes a long way in explaining the proliferation and the longevity of powerful monasteries in medieval Byzantium. A final element I wanted to note whose origins can be traced to the Middle Byzantine period is the Great Monastery's adoption of the model provided by the aristocratic household, the oikos, or oikoi in the plural, of the time. Great monasteries followed closely this model in terms of physical appearance and function. Like the monastic establishments, oikoi were complexes made of various buildings, including a church. They owned far-flung properties managed by dedicated personnel in order, in particular, to provide for the needs of a large number of household dependents. Very much like monasteries. Monasteries followed the oikos, also with regard to economic mentality. In the monastic rules produced in the 11th century and later, we encounter the same turn towards a more efficient and profitable management of properties we see among aristocrats at the time. All this was natural, given that great monasteries were usually founded by aristocrats who reproduced the model of their own household while on many occasions the monastery and its properties were nothing else but the continuation of a transformed lay oikos. This said, it is likely that in this domain the movement of ideas was two-way, meaning that oiki too may have been adopting over the years practices originating in the monasteries. I pass to the second section, aims and results. So as I noted in the introduction, we can distinguish three main aims in the case of Great Byzantine monasteries. Aims which, under which we may group all the various functions. The first was to guarantee, perpetuate the existence of a large community dedicated to prayer, which I mentioned. The second, cater to certain needs of society. The third, mentioned already a few times, serve the emperor or the empire. So, I maintain that the great Byzantine monasteries delivered on all three. Many houses achieved remarkable longevity, often several centuries of distinguished existence, something which contrasts sharply with the fate of aristocratic oiki, with which they shared so much otherwise. Many monasteries outlasted the empire itself. It is interesting that the decline and disappearance of great monasteries was very often the result of external political factors, most notably the various Turkish conquests, which either destroyed them physically, as it often happened in Asia Minor, or changed dramatically the institutional framework, removing the Christian emperor and aristocracy. Great monasteries were able to maintain a sufficiently high level of prosperity over long periods, on the one hand, through a generally sound economic management, and on the other, thanks to the continued exchanges with patrons, that is, the emperor and the aristocracy. Given that profit or luxury was not the aim, as we said, in fact, both condemned in our text, the contemporary medieval text, monastic leaders ought not only secure what was necessary in order to cover the needs of the monks and the maintenance of their buildings. So, leaving aside certain rare monasteries which received annual subventions capable of covering their expenses, especially in the Middle Byzantine period before the 13th century, monks could only secure a stable annual income through the exploitation of their property, largely consisting of immovable assets, that is, villages, lands, and houses. As already noted, since the 11th century, we can detect an emphasis on efficient and surplus-yielding management. Another activity that produced income for the monks was the cultivation of their relations with the emperor and the aristocracy. Famous and influential monasteries could count on receiving every year a number of sizable cash donations. Could also hope for an occasional bonanza. Still, this source of income was of secondary importance since it was rather uncertain and varied significantly over year to year. A third source of income for monasteries were the monks' entrepreneurial activities, including investment in trade, money lending, and the sale of annual pensions, the so-called adelfata, brotherhoods. There's a relatively little evidence on such activities, which to some extent is a reflection of the nature of our documentation, which privileges property. However, what is available on monastic enterprise suggests a rather low scale of involvement. The known monastic boats were small, the monastic fleets modest, the documented banking activities rather primitive. On one would look in vain, I think, trying to find great monastic trade companies or banks. That the monks' emphasis was on property and exploitation rather than on enterprise is also shown by the focus on land acquisition. The monastery's annual cash surpluses were typically directed to the purchase of land. It was obviously a conservative behavior, but at the same time entirely to be expected in view of the ideological and institutional framework that determined their activities. It also made perfect sense for establishments whose aim was not profit or rapid expansion, but above all security, longevity, and as much as possible, freedom from worldly concerns. So this was the first section. I'll pass to the third section, which is the longest one, and more detail, which is one of the saints I identified, and which is particularly medieval, as I said, and I'm also I will be taking the example of Mount Athos to illustrate this and to examine it. So the example of Mount Athos, I'll show you here. Mount Athos is of course this rather mountainous peninsula off the peninsula of Chalkidiki. It has a very high mountain, and Mount Athos is more than 2,000 meters. And it already, since the 10th century, it housed a collection of important monasteries. So the example of Mount Athos is particularly appropriate, an example for a number of reasons. First of all, the history of the Athonite monastery spans the entire period examined in my paper. In fact, it continues to this day. Moreover, Mount Athos comprised several extremely prestigious monasteries, such as, I'm just mentioning two, Lavra and Vatopedi, and I'm just showing you Lavra as it is today. What you see is mostly Ottoman in reality, but the main church, the Catholicon, the tower, and part of the fortification, certainly also the location, is medieval. So, certain, and it comprised several extremely prestigious monasteries, and and as a whole, it became, from early on, a major monastic center and a leader in spiritual matters across the empire and beyond its borders, in fact. Finally, thanks to the documents preserved in the archives of the Athonite monasteries, in their libraries, their relations with the imperial authorities are well documented, most notably those regarding the more tangible services they offered to Constantinople. So, indeed, the services emperors expected from great monasteries can be grouped into two categories. Services of an ideological nature, in particular the legitimization of the emperor, promotion of his political agenda, and the backing of his claims over the territory, and services of a practical nature, especially the defense and economic development of a region. In what follows, I'm building on the substantial work done by several scholars, notably Nicholas Voronos, Rosemary Morris, and Rosa Benoit Meguenis. In both their ideological and their practical tasks, the Athonites proved more than adequate imperial servants and showed that the continued donations and privileges the rulers awarded them were a good placement of state resources. I begin with the services concerning the sphere of ideas. The establishment of great monasteries on Mount Athos was from the beginning supported and promoted by Constantinople, as seen already in the case of Lavra, founded in 963, partly thanks to money of Emperor Nikephoros II Phocas, and I'm showing you here a gold coin of that emperor. A monk-loving emperor. In the 10th and 11th century, all significant establishments of the Holy Mountain were endowed with lands and awarded subventions and privileges by a series of emperors. The acceptance of these acts of imperial generosity by the monks was in itself hugely significant for the emperors, given the prestige and influence of the monasteries and of the Holy Mountain as a whole. Preambles of imperial charters from the 11th to the 14th century regularly refer to the importance of the monks' prayers for society and empire. The monks' prayers helped secure the spiritual welfare of the people while also averting natural disasters. The monks' prayers, said to be more efficacious against enemies than regiments of soldiers, were particularly demanded by emperors ahead of military campaigns. It is evident that the emperors drew enormous propaganda benefits from the patronage of prestigious monasteries. This was one of the most efficacious ways to present themselves as legitimate Orthodox rulers to the deeply religious Byzantine society. By commanding the monks to pray, the emperors were taking care of both the spiritual and the physical welfare of their subjects, while the monastery's acceptance of the ruler's patronage signified, quotes, acceptance of them. How much the prestige of the Holy Mountain was appreciated by rulers can also be seen in the fact that leaders of other Orthodox countries sought to establish national monasteries there, or to adopt a monastery by becoming its main patron, so as to place their state and themselves along with the Roman Empire and the emperor. The Athonite support was especially valuable to emperors in periods of political crisis, as shown by the example of Andronicus II Palaiologos, shown here. In a document he offered to a monastery. Actually, no, it's on the document from Marcia, but exceptional, it's on the monastery. The Athonites, so the emperor, this is the emperor who, in the last decades of the 13th century, presided over the loss of Byzantine Asia Minor to the Turks, roughly half the empire's territory. You see the empire soon, before his accession, the emperor of his father, Michael VIII Palaiologos, the reconstituted Byzantine Empire after the Fourth Crusade had fragmented it, and now the empire, soon after the end of his reign, much diminished, or practically all of Asia Minor lost, and also territory in the Balkans lost. So, in spite of suffering constant military defeats and imposing harsh fiscal measures, Andronicus II remained on the throne for almost 50 years. This happened because he never lost the favor of those who could overthrow him or of those whose support was crucial. It is notable that during a period of financial crisis and of deep cuts in spending, the emperor's relatives and close associates thrived, as did several monasteries, most notably Lavra, which received a number of important imperial donations at precisely this time. The patronage of this prestigious monastery was obviously part of Andronicus's ultimately successful strategy to neutralize any dangerous resistance to his rule. Mount Athos also offers an excellent example through which to observe the value of great monasteries in allowing the emperor to reclaim or assert his authority over recently recovered or contested territories. Let's go back in time to the 10th century. The turning of Mount Athos in the mid-10th century into an important holy mountain comprising powerful monasteries which were led by influential figures of the caliber of St. Athanasius of Lavra was clearly related to Constantinople's effort to secure and enhance its control over an area, the Chalkidiki and the Simon region, which had been recovered relatively recently in the 9th century, which also was inhabited by large numbers of Slavic speakers and was under Bulgarian threat. And this is a map based on early 14th century documentation, but it's what it depicts clearly relates to a much earlier period. It depicts in rounds villages known from the Athonite documents, which included Slavic peasants with Slavic names, and there are three types. Those who are the white dots are the villages with up to less than 33% of Slavic names, up to more than 50% in the dark dots. So there was and this is the 14th century. So several centuries after the regions recovered by the Byzantines. And of course the Bulgarian thread is very clearly visible in this map. It was very much present at the time when the first monasteries were founded in the late 10th century. So this, as I said, it's related. It was related to. I was saying that the foundation of the Holy Mountain is certainly related to the effort of Constantinople to secure and enhance its control over this area. In fact, soon after the conquest of the region by the Byzantines, so in the 9th century, the region of Chalkidiki, Limon, the Byzantine army created a string of small fortified towns, castra, which were seats of a governor and a bishop, as well as of military detachment. And this map shows you precisely this, again, known thanks to the Athonite documents. Not Thessaloniki, of course, but places like Cassandria, Vria, Hermilia, tiny places, which became towns with a bishop and everything. Clearly artificial creations by the state. For obvious purposes. So, the original wave of foundation of the great Athonite monasteries from the 960s to the early 11th century came 2 to 3 generations after this initial attempt of the Byzantines to secure their rule over the areas in question. The monks were in effect the extension of imperial power in the region and the proof of Constantinople's sovereignty. After a first military type intervention, the establishment of the monasteries may be seen as a turn to a soft power approach, which aimed at deepening and intensifying the region's attachment to the empire. The Athonite monasteries were outstanding centers of religion and culture and were given extensive possession in Chalkidiki and the lower Strimon region, including many villages. And I'm showing here a map with the possessions, showing known important possessions of Athonite monasteries in the Chalkidiki in particular, with numbers. Everything that is important and known has been put on this map, and this is around 1100. Documentation is not so perfect in the 11th century. It's much better in the 14th century, where you see a much more dense network of important Athonite possessions in the peninsula. Of course, it also grew over time, and you would get a similar image from the Smyrlis area. So the durability of the monasteries made their dependencies a permanent network of loci of imperial presence in the Macedonian countryside, while the holy aura of the monks made them particularly potent yet subtle agents of Constantinople. Mount Athos, along with Macedonia, was lost to the Byzantines after the conquest of Constantinople in 1204 by the Fourth Crusade, but was recovered towards the middle of the 13th century. I'm showing you again this map. The political context, however, remained critical and worsened substantially for the Byzantines in the 14th century. Mount Athos was now again near the frontier and to areas claimed by the Bulgarians and the Serbs. In this period, the monastery of Mount Athos upheld Constantinople's claims over contested or lost territory. Western Macedonia, much of Byzantine Macedonia was lost in 1345 to the Serbs, who conquered basically the entire Western Balkans. When in 1345 the ambitious Serbian conqueror of Macedonia, Stefan Dusan, which is depicted here in imperial Byzantine costume, asked the Athenites to commemorate his name as they did of the emperor Constantinople. In exchange for his favor, the monks insisted that they would only commemorate him second, after the emperor of Constantinople. The Byzantines would recover Macedonia from the Serbs in 1371, but only briefly. The region was conquered again in the 1380s, this time by the Ottomans, who, after handing it back to the Byzantines in the early 15th century, conquered it definitively in the 1420s. During these occupations, the Athenites recognized the Ottomans' authority, but continued to consider themselves Roman subjects and to commemorate the Emperor of Constantinople. After 1453, the Athenites would perpetuate the idea of the Roman Empire, of which they were now the only representatives along with the Church. I shall end my talk with a note on the practical services the Athenites offered to Constantinople, which, as in the case of the assertion of sovereignty claims, they were particularly crucial during periods which were critical. So, the foundation of a number of powerful monasteries on Mount Athos in the late 10th, from the late 10th century, had a huge impact on the economy of the region. The larger monasteries were not different in terms of size from most of the towns of the time, which comprised a few hundred inhabitants. While Mount Athos as a whole, with a population that in the early 11th century must have been around 2,000, would rank among the more significant towns of the region. All the settlement took place on a small mountainous peninsula that used to house a few hermits before the 10th century, the late 10th century. But the foundation of the great Athenian houses meant much more than a simple demographic boost. The monasteries were immensely more significant in economic terms than the towns, the little towns of Chalkidiki in particular. The monks controlled much greater cash resources, while many of them were literate. Several monks were in fact aristocrats and ex-civil servants who possessed superior administrative skills and were aware of the latest economic developments. The foundation of Mount Athos thus meant a massive injection of cash and know-how into a relatively backward region, which nevertheless had economic potential, and while also being significant in strategic terms. The monasteries established estates, organized their management, and acquired ships to transport produce. The Athenites stimulated the economy of the region, increasing fast its agricultural output and contributing to demographic growth. All this must have been well understood, if not, in fact, intended by Constantinople, to whose support Mount Athos owed its existence. We do not know much about Athos in the 12th and early 13th century, owing to the scarcity of documents. Evidence coming from the relatively well-documented period between the late 13th to the early 15th century again underlines the services the monks provided to the empire. Most of this period was characterized by political troubles with frequent invasions and incursions, while from the middle of the 14th century the entire region suffered repeated appearances of the plague, circumstances that affected most adversely the province's economy and settlement. From the early 14th century, the regions where the Athonite estates were situated were exposed to Turkish piracy from Asia Minor, which severely disrupted the economy and led to the enslavement or flight of the peasants working the land. The documentation of this period allows us to see that the Athonites carried a vast program of fortification of their estates, building dozens of towers to protect not only the administrators, but also the peasants and the movable wealth of the properties. And I'm showing you here two maps dealing with fortifications, mostly towers of estates. It's practically all estates of Athonite monasteries. These are, of course, all. To the left, you have a map showing towers, estate towers known from documents, from texts, and so we know the owner, we know the date, pretty much. And you see high concentration in precisely, of course, the same areas where the monasteries had their estates, and which also happen to be the coastal, the fertile coastal regions. And this map shows you buildings still standing or still identified through inspection today, which complements to some extent the documentary evidence, although some of those standing preserved towers may be only Ottoman. Apart from building towers in their estates, the monks also resettled systematically peasants, usually from inland areas, to estates depopulated on account of piracy and the plague in Macedonia, as well as on the island of Limnos, on which they had extensive properties. It is hard to estimate the impact of these measures, but it must have been significant. Indeed, we can see a high degree of continuity in the occupation and exploitation of the Athonite estates in the 14th and 15th century, which contrasts dramatically with the image offered by the estates of the lay persons. The lay persons generally lacked the monks' resources and were much more affected by expropriation following the frequent changes of regime. As a result, their estates tended to become depopulated and abandoned. So, the monasteries played in this period a crucial role in maintaining the settlement and exploitation in the fertile areas of the coast that would have been surely abandoned otherwise, providing a huge service to the imperial treasury. In addition, by maintaining relatively well-settled and well-exploited estates, the monasteries in effect placed at the disposal of the emperor a reserve of revenue-producing assets that could be used to finance the military. This indeed happened on several occasions, in the 1350s, 1370s, and 1400s, when the state seized many of the estates of the Athonites to fund its army. So I conclude. The nature of the early Byzantine monastery was a product of the compromise between the ascetic ideal of withdrawal and poverty and the reality of having to live in the world and accommodating society. To this basic duality of monasteries, a third element was added in the Middle Byzantine era, their imperial role. The enlisting of the monasteries in the imperial cause was perhaps a natural result of the general expansion of state intervention in the Middle Byzantine period. The concentration of all resources in the hands of the imperial government and then concomitant weakening of society during the period of crisis of the 7th and 8th century allowed or obliged the state to take over roles traditionally fulfilled by the aristocracy and the church. Whatever the exact reason may be, the addition of the imperial role proved to be a permanent one, and it transformed the character of the monasteries. The great Byzantine monasteries of the Middle and Late period cannot be understood without reference to their imperial aspect. This transformation meant that increased resources were placed at the monks' disposal, but it also meant that they now had to perform many new functions. In the end, the Great Byzantine Monastery proved a remarkably successful institution. It continued to fulfill to perfection its traditional functions while delivering invaluable services to the emperors of Constantinople. Thank you.
Thank you, Kostis, for this